$2.5 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's not a gray area buried in a compliance manual that a junior lawyer missed on page 47. That's a deliberate, multi-year operation to move some of the most restricted technology on the planet into the hands of people the United States government specifically, legally, and repeatedly said could not have it. And the woman, at the center of it, co-founded one of the most consequential server companies in American technology history. She's pleading not guilty. Charles Liang built Supermicro into a company worth roughly $20 billion at its peak. Server infrastructure, data centers, the unglamorous but load-bearing skeleton of the modern internet. His co-founder, Sai Kei, also known as Sarah Key, is the one now facing federal charges. Alongside her, a network of shell companies, freight forwarders, and intermediaries spread across multiple continents, all apparently organized around one operational objective: get NVIDIA chips, the precise models BIS had restricted for export to China, into China, at volume, repeatedly, without attracting attention. They attracted attention. The Department of Justice indictment, unsealed in early 2025, describes a scheme that ran from at least 2021 through 2023. That timing is not incidental. This wasn't a pre-sanctions gray market operation that someone forgot to wind down before the rules changed. This was active after the October 2022 export controls, active after the October 2023 tightening, active after every public and private signal Washington sent that it was serious, that this time, unlike the last several times, the enforcement would follow the rhetoric. Someone looked at all of that and kept shipping. That specific detail, the continuation well past October 2022, is the one I keep returning to, because it tells you something precise about how this network assessed risk. Either they believed enforcement was theater, or they had operational reasons to believe it. One of those possibilities is more disturbing than the other, and the indictment, read carefully, suggests it wasn't blind arrogance. It was a calculated bet about detection probability, which means someone did the math, and for roughly 2 years, the math was right. The mechanism, once you understand it, was not subtle. It was just built to survive the level of scrutiny it expected to face. Servers containing restricted NVIDIA H100 and A100 chips were routed through intermediary companies in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. Shell entities with names designed to signal nothing to a customs algorithm. Invoices altered to obscure what was physically inside the shipments. In multiple instances, end-user certificates signed by companies that either didn't exist in the form described or had no plausible legitimate commercial need for server-grade AI compute at that volume. The freight documentation, according to prosecutors, was engineered to pass a cursory check and fail a rigorous one. The operational assumption was that rigorous checks were rare enough that volume could compensate for occasional exposure. For 2 years, that assumption held. Here's the number that makes that assumption legible. U.S. Customs processes approximately 11 million import shipments per year. The Bureau of Industry and Security, the agency tasked with enforcing export controls across every restricted technology category, every jurisdiction, every freight corridor in the world, had an enforcement budget in fiscal year 2023 of approximately $190 million. Divide that across the scope of its mandate, and you start to understand why someone might calculate that the odds were structurally favorable. That is not a justification. It is an explanation, and it is also an indictment of the enforcement architecture that existed before Sai Kei made whatever choices she made. The end destinations described in the indictment were not ambiguous buyers. These weren't startup founders who misread the fine print on an export license application. The alleged recipients included entities with documented ties to Chinese state-affiliated research programs, precisely the organizations the October 2022 framework was designed to wall off from frontier AI compute, which means the vetting on the American export side either failed completely or the documentation was sophisticated enough to defeat it. The indictment's specific language points toward the latter. The paperwork was constructed for plausibility, not accuracy. It was designed to look like compliance while enabling its opposite. Psyche's legal team has entered a not guilty plea and indicated publicly that the charges are contested. Defense strategy in federal export control cases at this scale typically runs through several channels. Arguing the defendant lacked the requisite knowledge that controlled goods were involved, arguing that end-use certificates were believed to be accurate at the time of signing, or attacking the evidentiary chain in the documentation trail. For a case carrying this dollar figure, with this level of specificity in the indictment, the government would not have unsealed it without believing those lanes can be closed. The question is what they have to close them. What they appear to have, based on the public record, is a communications trail that shows deliberate structuring rather than negligent non-compliance. Export control prosecutions at this scale rarely succeed on document irregularities alone. They succeed when prosecutors can demonstrate that the defendant understood exactly what was happening and constructed a system specifically to continue doing it. The indictment's use of knowing and willful is the legal standard for criminal rather than civil liability. Federal prosecutors do not insert that language speculatively. It appears when the evidence supports it. Supermicro, as an institution, carries its own complicated regulatory history, and that context matters even if it doesn't prove anything about this specific case. In 2020, the company settled with the SEC for $17.5 million over accounting irregularities, no admission of wrongdoing, but a settlement substantial enough to require a full internal compliance overhaul. In 2018, Bloomberg published an explosive investigation alleging that Supermicro server motherboards had been implanted with surveillance hardware by Chinese intelligence during the manufacturing process. The company denied it. The intelligence community never publicly corroborated it. Bloomberg has stood by the story. The truth of that specific allegation remains formally unresolved. What it established, however, was that Supermicro occupied a peculiar position in the American technology landscape. A company with deep Taiwanese-American roots, significant manufacturing exposure to China, and a server product line that sat at the intersection of commercial infrastructure and national security infrastructure simultaneously. Charles Liang has not been charged. Supermicro issued a statement positioning the alleged conduct as the actions of a former executive operating outside her authority, framing the company as an institution wronged by a rogue actor rather than one with systemic compliance failures. That framing is legally deliberate. Whether it survives the discovery process and whether the communications trail the government holds implicates anyone beyond Psyche is the question that will define how large this case ultimately becomes. Now, and this is where I want to apply some pressure to the version of this story that's been circulating in the technology press, because the dominant framing has a significant blind spot. The story being told is, China wanted chips. They found a corrupt insider. She moved the product. Law enforcement caught up. Clean narrative, satisfying, probably accurate in its outlines. But it systematically underweights what the operation reveals about the export control system itself. $2.5 billion worth of restricted servers did not transit international borders through a single point of failure in one person's decision-making. It moved through freight forwarders who processed the shipping documentation, through customs officials at multiple ports who cleared the manifests, through financial institutions that processed the payments across jurisdictions, through logistics companies that physically handled and moved the cargo. Every node in that chain either failed to identify what was happening or made a decision not to examine it too carefully. That is not a rogue actor problem. That is a structural permeability problem, and those are solved by entirely different interventions. The BIS has been adding enforcement personnel and requesting budget increases since 2022. The Commerce Department has been explicit that export control violations now sit in the national security enforcement category rather than the trade compliance category. A meaningful shift in prosecutorial priority and interagency coordination. But the distance between the stated priority and the actual enforcement capacity remains measurable in the most concrete possible terms. In fiscal year 2023, BIS completed 60 criminal export control cases. 60. Against a global trade system processing hundreds of millions of shipments annually across thousands of freight corridors. The key case, if it results in conviction, will be among the highest dollar value export control prosecutions in American legal history. That distinction should not be read as evidence that the system is functioning. It should be read as a data point about how much could accumulate before detection. The chips themselves, the H100s and A100s allegedly inside those Supermicro servers, were not destined for storage. NVIDIA. H100s are trading at 2 to 3 times their US MSRP on Chinese gray markets, according to pricing data tracked by multiple semiconductor analysts through 2023 and 2024. A100s, restricted since October 2022, are embedded in Chinese AI training infrastructure at operational scale. Baidu, ByteDance, and several Chinese state research institutes have been reported across Reuters and South China Morning Post investigations to have acquired restricted chips through channels that don't map cleanly to BIS-approved export licenses. The key network was not the only channel. It was one of the channels that became visible. China's domestic compute program has made real progress that deserves honest acknowledgement, because dismissing it is how you end up surprised. SMIC's N+2 process node is in production. Huawei's Kirin 9010, manufactured domestically, outperformed expectations when it appeared in the Mate 60 Pro in late 2023. The broader MIIT-coordinated push toward compute self-sufficiency has budget, political mandate, and genuine engineering talent behind it. But it has not closed the frontier gap. H100 equivalent performance from domestic Chinese silicon is, by the most technically credible public assessments, including analysis from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown, still multiple years away from volume production at competitive yields. Every restricted chip that reaches China in the interim carries real operational value. It compresses that timeline. It allows training runs that domestic hardware cannot currently support. The smuggling networks are not just economic crime. They are a hedge against the domestic program's execution risk, and they are being run with that strategic logic in mind, whether or not every participant in the network articulates it that way. Here is my read, stated plainly, because I think the careful version obscures more than it clarifies. The not guilty plea is almost certainly a negotiating position. Federal export control prosecutions at this dollar value, with this level of documentary specificity in the public indictment, resolve through plea agreements far more often than through trial acquittals. The government's interest is not primarily punishment, it is network exposure. The freight forwarder in Singapore who processed the altered invoices without asking the obvious question. The intermediary entity in Dubai whose principals signed end-user certificates for compute infrastructure they had no operational use for. The financial channels that moved payments across jurisdictions in structures that obscured the underlying transaction. Those are the names DOJ wants. SIK currently holds the only documented position inside the indictment. Cooperation has a price, and in federal cases of this architecture, the price is usually a sentence reduction substantial enough to make cooperation rational. My prediction, and I'll be specific enough that this can be checked, is that this case resolves through a plea agreement within 18 months of the indictment date, that the plea exposes at minimum 2 additional named defendants in the logistics and financial layers of the operation, and that the resulting DOJ press release will be presented as a demonstration of enforcement strength, while the structural funding gap at BIS remains largely unaddressed. The doubt I hold openly. We do not know the actual volume of what moved. $2.5 billion is the figure attached to the network that got caught, which means it became visible through some investigative thread, a financial anomaly, a customs flag, a cooperating witness somewhere in the chain who decided the math had changed. Every network that hasn't generated that triggering event is, by definition, not in the public record. The key figure is a floor, it is not a ceiling. And the honest answer to how much restricted compute has reached China since October 2022 is that nobody in the public domain actually knows. What we do know is structural. The gap between what the October 2022 controls were designed to prevent and what they have actually prevented is measurable in gray market chip prices, in the continued advancement of Chinese AI model capability, in the smuggling cases that surface periodically and represent, almost certainly, a fraction of the operational volume. Washington has built an increasingly sophisticated legal architecture for export control. The entity list, the foreign direct product rule, the end-user verification requirements, the third country controls attempted in 2023. The enforcement infrastructure beneath that architecture is a $190 million agency asked to police a multi-trillion-dollar global technology trade. That asymmetry is the actual story. SYK allegedly exploited it. She is not the last person who will. The servers are already in China. They're already running. The models trained on them are already being developed. And somewhere in a logistics office in a mid-tier Southeast Asian city, someone is looking at the key indictment, updating their probability estimate, and deciding whether the new odds are still favorable enough to continue. My honest assessment, for some of them, they still are. Not because they're reckless, because the math still works. And until the enforcement architecture is funded to the level the policy ambition requires, not incrementally improved, but fundamentally rebuilt for the scale of the problem, the math will keep working for someone. That's what a $2.5 billion not guilty plea actually tells you if you read it as a diagnostic rather than a verdict. If you want to follow how this develops, the plea timeline, the network exposure, whether BIS gets the budget increase it has requested for 3 consecutive fiscal years and not received, this channel will cover it. The next chapter of this case will be more revealing than the indictment.